This week we're having a seminar focusing on water in the celebration of World Water Day, which is on the 22nd of March. And today we've got a team event where we have three people that are going to be presenting on understanding and managing Australia's water resources. Now, for many people who are unfamiliar with Geoscience Australia, the immediate response will be, what's a geoscience agency got to do with water? What you're going to hear today is exactly how much we have to do with water and how important the work that Geoscience Australia does is to managing Australia's water resources. You're going to hear from three distinguished speakers today, and I'm going to introduce them all in turn now before they then tag team on the presentation. So I'm going to ask them to stand up. So first up, Narelle Newman. Stand up, Narelle. Dr. Narelle Newman is currently heading up our groundwater branch. She joined Geoscience Australia in 2001, working in regional projects focused on collection, integration and interpretation of a range of geoscience data sets to understand the geological evolution of the Australian continent. It's fair to say Narelle is wet behind the ears when it comes to water, but because she's just taken on leadership of the groundwater group, but she's rapidly come to speed and really getting her head around exactly the work we do in water, in groundwater in particular. Next up, Adam Lewis. Dr. Adam Lewis leads GEO's National Earth and Marine Observation Branch, so focusing on the salty, wet stuff. He worked for almost 10 years, he's worked for the last 10 years developing our Earth observations from space capabilities and has and those capabilities are increasingly developing incredibly useful tools for managing Australia's water, which you'll hear about. Thirdly, Simon Costello. Simon leads our National Location Information Branch. He's worked for 14 years with Geoscience Australia, including a stint with the Public Sector Mapping Agency and the UN, and working with the UN in establishing and managing our geographic data sets and products, including in particular work around our mapping of water nationally. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Simon first, who's going to kick us off. Please give them, the three of them, a welcome. Thanks.
Thanks, Stuart. I'm going to start by sort of setting the context, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, but particularly to show, as Stuart alluded to, what GA's role in water is, and focus on or highlight the three different areas that I guess GA focuses on. So information stewardship, exploitation of information in new ways, and the application of science to provide advice on water. So we're all aware Australia is the driest inhabited continent on Earth, but we live in a land of droughts and flooding rains. So we always go from one extreme to the other. So getting an understanding of that water variability in the landscape is actually pretty important for our survival in such a varied and extreme landscape. So the kinds of questions that people ask are things like, where does water flow? How does the quantity or quality of that water change through time or as a result of an event? What else might be affected by changes in water quantity and quality? So for example, the Brisbane CBD. And how do we secure supply of water for our communities into the future? So as a nation, we depend on understanding that variability of water in the landscape. And GA, as we're about to show you today, has a very significant role in developing and maintaining that knowledge. You might have heard of this term about wicked problems. Wicked problems are those big problems that, apart from being very complex to understand, require very complex solutions to apply. And often if you try and apply a solution to part of that problem, it has a knock-on effect somewhere else. And often what you need here is groups of people from different walks of life, different parts of government, all working together on different aspects of the same problem. And things like climate change, institutional abuse, Water and security of water in this country is another one of these wicked problems. So what it requires is a lot of cross-sector work. It means we've got to work with people who understand the policy space, but not just within their own sector, across a whole range of sectors that have an interest in water. There's a role for cross-sector information stewardship. So it's not just about water information, but all the other sets of information that are needed that are related to water for someone to make a decision with. And then finally, you need the cross-disciplinary science and analysis, not just water science, but all the other types of science and disciplines that are needed to help understand what problems are and develop solutions to each part of the problem. Those of you who were reading the papers on Saturday will have seen this article in the Canberra Times by Bruce Hay. He's talking about the cuts to CSIRO's Land and Water Division. In his final paragraphs, he makes this comment about water being Australia's most precious natural resource, and how it underpins our cities, our food supply and our much-loved landscapes and wildlife. I think there's no question about that. What he raises there is that we still don't know how much water we have, where it is, how groundwater and surface water interact, and how climate's affecting those supplies. And this is what he sees as the role of water science. What I got out of reading this article was, yes, there is a cut to a particular part of our society, but they are not the only people that do this. GA also does a lot of this stuff, and I think it's time that we recognise that GA also has an important role in this as well. So if someone gets affected somewhere else, there is someone else who can step up in this as well. So why GA? GA is Australia's preeminent public sector geoscience agency. What does geoscience mean? Geoscience is a very diverse group of disciplines, ranging from geography, spatial science, through to geology and water science as well. So GA has a diverse professional expertise. We also have very strong partnerships with other parts of government and with industry as well. Because we are appropriated directly from government, we can come in with a very trusted reputation, and a reputation for providing trusted advice and knowledge as well. The 6 areas I've highlighted up there are our 6 priority areas, of which you'll know that water is one. So out of this, GA's particular role, as I mentioned before, narrows down to two particular fields. We are an information steward, and what we want to do is, as well as maintain that information, find new ways to exploit that information to find new solutions for problems around water. As well as that, we also have a role in undertaking cross-disciplinary science and research to then provide advice on those water issues, in particular in groundwater. So I'll start by looking at the information stewardship side of things. Adam will talk about exploitation of information, and then Narelle will talk about the science and research and wrap up. So as part of its role, GA is Australia's National Geospatial Information Authority. So what does this mean? So yeah, we do national mapping, fine, but we do that in a way where we work with the states and territories to coordinate collection, management and delivery of location information. We then use that information to provide advice to support Australian government priorities, of which water security is one. Our information supports the Water Act that was legislated in 2007. So whilst we're not specifically mentioned in the Water Act, we support agencies like the Murray-Darling Basin Authority and the Bureau of Met, who are mentioned in there, in order to carry out their work. Not only do we support Commonwealth responsibilities, but by working with the states and territories, we support their legislation. Their role in water is slightly different, but it's all complementary. They have interest in water around regulation of water, but also in terms of broader natural resource management and in emergency management as well. That's all enshrined in their legislation. So this information is actually supporting a whole range of legislations at different levels of government. It's the same information used for multiple purposes by multiple users. That's an important consideration in decision making. Those of you who are familiar with work in the Murray-Darling Basin will know how contentious and how political that is. One way of removing the contention out of that is to ensure that everyone is making decisions off the same information. If they come to different conclusions, that's just because of their decision-making process, not because they've got access to a different set of information. So our location information has a broad reach and a broad impact, and in the water space, all these different users rely on that same information to make decisions. So people who are about supplying water, people trying to navigate through water. Can I drive down this road because it's subject to seasonal flooding? People who rely on our information to work out whether water infrastructure needs to be built, what the effects of environmental flows are on the landscape, what the effects of water quality and quantity in the coastal zone are, and in rivers, use of water in agriculture, drought, and in flood events as well. So these are some specific examples of formal collaborations that GA has with other parts of the Australian government. This is just a snapshot. Both Adam and Narelle will refer to others in their presentations as well. But we have a very close working relationship with the Attorney General's Department. Their role in water is around disaster management, both in terms of preparing for a flood event, responding to a flood event, but more importantly the recovery from a flood event. So remember that picture I put up around Brisbane in my introduction? They are responsible for handing out hundreds of millions of dollars in recovery aid to areas affected by flooding, particularly after the Brisbane flood events. So they need to know and rely upon a trusted set of information in order to make those decisions accurately and make sure that money is spent in the most appropriate way. We've worked with the Department of Environment to produce a wastewater treatment information set. This is actually really important for the state of environment reporting because they need to know where the locations of sewage plants were to be able to monitor water quality downstream and also assess the impacts if there was a spill out of that sewage treatment plant on infrastructure and the environment downstream. We have worked quite closely with the Bureau of Meteorology over the last 10 years in the Geofabric program. So their role is around forecasting and water observations, but they need our information to be able to work out where that water flows, both within particular stream beds but also across the landscape into the stream beds. We've worked very closely with the Murray Basin over the last few years on what's been the largest acquisition of LiDAR in the southern hemisphere. It's an area of over 70,000 square kilometres in floodplains in the Murray Basin where they needed highly accurate and highly precise models of the surface to assess the impacts of changing environmental flows on both vegetation and on pastoral holdings in those areas. And we've worked with the Commonwealth Grants Commission to look at the sustainability of water in remote communities and give them advice on where they might consider investing in water infrastructure in those remote communities as well. So it's a whole raft of work that we do, or that we have done, and that work continues. We also are making our information more accessible with water. So through a range of different portals such as National Map, interactive maps, Elvis, the new elevation information system, and even through the flood risk portal. We make that information, which is now openly available, to a wider range of audiences in ways that they can interact with a lot more easily. And finally, we are improving the quality of that information. Up until probably 10 years ago, this is the extent of a lot of the water information that GA had. So we knew where lakes and rivers were, and we could have a guess at how perennial they were. But that was sort of based on quite old information and a bit of a, I'll have a guess. So nowadays, with the facilities and technology that Adam will talk about, we can actually determine the perenniality of things like lakes, and the Menindee lakes in this case, based on observations through time. It's scientific, it's repeatable, it's defensible. So from there we can now come up with a figure that actually says, yes, the lake on the top right is pretty much full all the time, it's perennial. But other lakes, we can calculate a perenniality that's quite different and more accurately reflecting the amount of water that's in those lakes at the time. As well as perenniality, we can actually do science-based stream ordering, which is an important piece of information, not just for map-making purposes, but also for a lot of water modelling and analysis. And then I mentioned before about the LiDAR acquisition. we are now in a position where we can create more accurate and more precise elevation and surface models using new technologies that GA has access to. Things like shuttle radar, airborne lasers or LiDAR, and improvements to aerial photography. And hopefully you can see on that slide there, you've actually got a different catchment delineation. So this is the old one, based on poorer quality information. We can now more accurately reflect where the divide is between the two catchments. And this is quite a large area, this is in the order of kilometres, where water is now actually flowing that way instead of that way. Now that's implications for the management of the water as well. So that's it for me. I'll now hand over to Adam to talk about water observations from space.
Thanks, Simon. Sorry, guys. So my job for the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to go back to his slide, where was it? Is to talk about some of the ways in which you've been fairly innovative in using new observing technologies to try and capture the water in this continent. So Simon talked about those two images on the left. They're statements of numbers. So where do those measurements come from? And the bottom left graph, a statement of how much water is in a lake. Where do you get that sort of information? And particularly, where do we get it for a continent the size of Australia? And surely we need it, because if we can't map the water and if we can't measure it in some sense, then how can we manage it? So in this context, Geoscience Australia is a very nice organisation to work in, because we're not too big and we're quite diverse. And so we have an opportunity to bring different observing capabilities to our problems rather than to have those problems in a box. And these ones are about satellites, so observations from space. There's stuff in space. The US, Europe, Japan, China, South Korea, India are nations that launch a lot of scientific satellites, and they tend to share those with us, and so we have the opportunity to leverage and apply their data streams to our problems. So satellites orbit all the time, as you all know, and satellite images aren't that unusual anymore. So here's a satellite image of Lake Burley Griffin. And it's at one point in time. But it's also not just an image, it's actually a scientific measurement. Well, it's actually about 6,000 by 6,000, about 36 million scientific measurements actually. And each of those measurements is a sample of certain parts of the electromagnetic spectrum, the reflectance in that electromagnetic spectrum, from thermal wavelengths through to sub-blue wavelengths, short wavelengths. And that means we can actually use those measurements to do analysis. So if we take, for every pixel, those measurements, and we run it through this decision tree that Norman Mueller, who might be in the audience, invented, it says if a certain measurement is above this threshold, then go this way. If the next measurement is below that threshold, go that way. If you end up at a blue node, you've got water. If you end up at a red node, you've got not water. Works for the whole of Australia. So we can run those measurements through that and produce maps of water, non-water, for a particular satellite image. And we can do that for all of Australia. But that's kind of not the whole story. Because, and this is what it might look like for those lakes that Simon showed earlier. This is the blue part here has been, those pixels have all been through that decision tree, and the ones that came out blue are water. But as it happens, water doesn't stay the same for very long. So here's a different time of image and the water's less. And here's another image where we've got increased drying out and the water extent is again less. And once we move further we get to even less water, but the perennial lake has still got water in it, and there's a flush coming down the Darling River. So in fact we have stacks of these satellite images. So we have something like 600 images from the late 80s through to the present day for this particular area, in fact for all of Australia. So we can run that decision tree on every pixel and every image. So we've got a couple of 100,000 images, 36 million pixels in each one, 10 measurements each. You're into a billion sorts of measurements that get analysed, but we can actually do that using the high-performance computer at ANU. And when we do that, we can then condense that up to say, here's some colours that pertain to that, and the colours are decoded in this way. If it's blue, then we always see water there. If it's red, then we only see water there 3 or 4% of the time. And if it's anything in between, then it's somewhere between those measurements. And this is after we throw away all the measurements that are clouds and things like that, so it's only using the good stuff. And because we can do that over Australia, we can actually produce a map like this, where the colours mean the same thing I just said. That is reds, and the reds and yellows are the floodplains in the middle of Australia, which I hope you can see there. Opposite. Yeah. And there's some tiny little blue bits in there, which are our permanent water bodies that don't show up at this scale, because we're a very dry continent. This is the first time anybody had done this on a continent when we did this, and it was, as I said, Norman Mueller's work. And it's given us unique information about surface water, which turns out to be ridiculously useful. So it's a very simple idea, but when you actually start to look into this, it reveals a lot of information about the water, and the water informs about other things. So in terms of understanding our floodplain extents, which is why we initially did this work, this is a town called Chinchilla in Queensland, which got flooded twice in 2010-11. And the red stuff is the floodplain coming into the town, which is sort of in the middle on this Google Earth imagery. Over on the left, you can see a blue patch, which is their reservoir. Not a very well protected town. Kerrang in northern Victoria, different story. The floodplains, again the red-yellow, have got nice straight boundaries. They don't get into the town because they've obviously got levee banks, which would be tiny in this area, which divert the flow. And so you can see that mitigation is working. More than that, you can also look, if you're talking about which roads you're going to take to get into this place in a flood, there's some which tend to get covered in water at certain places and others which don't. And I don't have enough local knowledge to go beyond that, but places I have driven, these maps actually capture quite nicely places where the water crosses roads. Completely different. As Simon said, we can now look at each of these water bodies, and we can do this consistently across the whole country, and say just how perennial are they. So instead of just making up this is a perennial water body on our topographic maps, we can use some numbers and put those numbers behind it. We could even potentially look at whether that perenniality is changing through time. And if we can look at perenniality, we can sort of look at when a water body might have formed. Let me just go back. This box down the bottom, let me explain what that says. Can't read it because of the blurs, but this says that we've seen this clearly 236 times. Of the times that we've seen this point, there were 3 when we reckon there was water there, which is 1.3% of the time. But we're pretty confident, the bottom line is a confidence statement, that water does actually occur there in these sort of flood events. So we're capturing the lineage of these maps as well as the maps themselves, the colours. So here's a different approach. If we look at some dam and say, now I haven't got, the colours are behind this, we query that particular dam and say, when do we see water here actually? And this is time, and these blue dots are when we saw water. And we saw water first in about 1994. So you can be reasonably confident that that dam was built around about 1994 or shortly beforehand. So timing is accessible through these sorts of data sets. And this is a particularly innovative work that Steve Sagar is working on. We're really excited about it. And it's not about the water on land, it's water in the sea, but it's how the water in the sea is interacting with the shoreline. So the first thing Steve's done is identify which images are high and low tide, and he's mapped the intertidal zone. That's itself a non-trivial problem. This is Darwin in northern Australia. It's a huge intertidal zone. It's really hard to map it. Then he's going one step further in this work, which is to say, if we look at when the water was intersecting with land, we can actually map the shape of the beach, both in elevation and in geometry. And that's proving to be really promising. And these results are being validated at the moment, but they look really good. And here's another one where the water's telling us about the geology. The different colours here in the northeast versus the southwest tell us that there's a tiny shift in the topography in the middle of this lake in South Australia, and that tells us something about what the geology is doing. So just knowing about where water's been turns out to be incredibly powerful. But we're also, and this is what Leo Limburner and Arnold Deck and some people from SIRO are working on, can look at what these sorts of data sets can tell us about the quality of the water. So the quality of the water reflects in its colour. If you've got junk in the water, it'll have a different colour. And so if we put a couple of spots in Lake Burley Griffin and look how they've changed through time, correlate it with in situ measurements and pull out suspended sediment, we can extract graphs like this one. And here we've got, on this axis is the suspended sediment estimate. This is 1987 up to 2000, and it's pretty murky and variable. Then it goes through a patch in 2000 to 2011, corresponding to the drought, when there's not much stuff flowing in and the water quality actually improves. Then there's a great big drought in floods in 2010-11. Anybody who goes windsurfing stopped doing it on the lake about here because it went very mucky. So that's pretty interesting stuff. The potential to be able to do that for large water bodies across broad parts of the country is really powerful. And then we can go further. Leo's gone further and said, let's draw a line through this lake from the intake through to the dam, crosses a couple of bridges here, and look on that line how clear the water was at each point, and then do that through time. And we get some extraordinary data out of this, which started in 1987. So here's the line. This is the intake. That's the dam down here. And the colour is more red if it's more muddy. So you start in 87 at one end, it's pretty muddy, and it's pretty clear down the other. These are the bridges. So you see the bridges coming up as they're not water. Certainly not clear water. So there's a big patch of turbid water in this period up to 98, and then it clears up. The upper reaches, and you look at the water between these two bridges, it's always pretty muddy compared to the water down here. You're capturing some of the really interesting dynamics of this water body, with these things as being big flood events coming through and increasing the turbidity. So we've got some remarkable capabilities emerging. The water also tends to impact things like the vegetation, and so one of the things Narelle will talk about, I think, is the interaction of vegetation with water. And vegetation expresses in many ways. In this particular picture, vegetation is measured by ground cover. How much cover is there on the ground? And here we've got red is no cover. So this is a great big rock, sort of in the middle of Australia, called Uluru, and it's red. There's no vegetation on it. What happens, though, is we've got denser vegetation, more ground cover around that rock, and that's clearly due to a process, the process of water running off the rock and feeding the vegetation that surrounds it. So here we can see the interaction of water with features in the landscape and start to understand processes. Now, the other reason you might have green patches in the middle of nowhere would be as if it was interacting with groundwater. So, and we can take those further and look at changes in vegetation through time which correspond to changes in water regimes. What we've done with this data set is scratch the surface, and I'll talk a little bit more about some potential things. So we've begun to scratch the surface of what we can see of water from space. Right out at the far end, though, is other things, like water has mass, and satellites that measure gravity can detect that mass. And so gravity measuring satellites pick up variations in the quantity of water in the atmosphere, on the surface of the soil, and in the groundwater. And those things are being used more productively now after since 2002, learning how to work with the data. This is a map of the US showing how wet the groundwater is compared to the norm. So in certain patches, like California, Sacramento Valley, it's really dry, and they've used a lot of groundwater up. These things they can now use and monitor on a regular pattern. And this made the LA Times in 2014, obviously, showing that how much the cumulative water changes from 2002 through 2014 due to increased use of groundwater and drought. So these are pretty exciting new ways that water might be looked at. And they're not going away. These sorts of observations from space are going to continue to grow in richness and diversity and veracity. So one thing nobody disagrees with is that the number of observations coming from these sources is just going through the roof. We've got more satellites, more scientific instruments of higher quality returning better data. So we're going to keep working out how to use these measurements to good effect. There are satellites planned like the Surface Water Ocean Topography mission, that NASA and the French Space Agency in the UK are co-sponsoring. This was recommended in a 2007 Decadal Earth Observation Plan from NASA, and they've been trying to work out how to build it and how to fund it since then. But this mission would potentially measure the water height of every large water body every 20 days for the whole globe between 70 degrees north and south. So that would bring in remarkable capabilities to quantify our water bodies and what's happening in the landscape. It's ocean topography because it just so happens that if you want to understand the fine scale structure of the ocean, then you look at the variations in altimetry at a fine scale, and that happens to be a similar sort of measurement to what you can use for surface water. And then I'm just going to finish off with this particular thing here, but even now we have new satellites. The European Commission and European Union and European Space Agency have launched the Sentinel series of satellites under their Copernicus program. Sentinel-2 is now capturing data at 10-metre resolution. So what I've been talking about primarily in our water observations from space was 20-metre resolution, 25-metre. Sentinel-2 brings down the spatial resolution, increases the spectral resolution, and increases the frequency of coverage to every few days. So these images are worth about 10 times as much in data as the previous images we've been using, and the measurements are more precise. And they're going to show extraordinary things, and this probably captures that extraordinariness more than any words will. This is actually an algal plume in the Baltic Sea. Now, I have been to the Baltic Sea, but I've never seen anything like that. I don't think you can see that with your naked eye. This is a great big gyre. This thing here is a boat. So that's the boat trail, and the rest is the biological activity in the ocean that's detectable from these sorts of satellites. So as we go forward with these, we'll start to monitor the quality and quantity of water on the surface and potentially beneath the surface with these new observing capabilities. And now Narelle's going to tell you why that might be useful. Thanks.
Thanks, Adam. So I guess so far what we've heard about is water on the surface, and what I'd like to do in the next part of the talk is actually take water to the 3D, and that's really about how surface water interacts with groundwater. And we're interested in groundwater because it actually represents around 17% of available water in Australia, and nearly a third of the water that's consumable within Australia. So it's a really significant part of the water resource for Australia. And in many ways, and in many places, it's really the only source of water for regional and remote communities, as well as for mining developments, which might be in isolated places. Groundwater also has a pretty significant economic value, with around $6.8 billion per annum to GDP. So it actually has a value within our economy, as well as being useful for communities. And the importance of groundwater is really only going to increase as population grows. We see climate change and expansion in Northern Australia. So groundwater is a really important part of the overall water budget within Australia. Within Geoscience Australia, we actually use a range of skills from right across the agency to understand groundwater. And our approach is to use geoscience-based multi-disciplinary science systems to understand groundwater. Our goal is the more rapid, quantitative and cost-effective mapping, characterisation and assessment, as well as the modelling of groundwater systems. And in doing that, we're really trying to use some new technologies and new concepts to understand groundwater within the Australian landscape, which is a very different landscape to many other parts of the globe. And the impact of that is to really understand groundwater systems in order to provide advice to government and other stakeholders about the groundwater resources that are within Australia and the processes and impacts that might occur with groundwater as we change the environment. So what I'd like to do in the talk here is really talk about some of the regional programs we have underway understanding groundwater within the Australian continent, and also show you some of those new and emerging approaches and technologies that we're applying within our program here at GA. One of the key programs that we're undertaking at the moment is the bioregional assessments, and this is a major program that we're undertaking in collaboration with the Department of Environment, the Bureau of Meteorology and CSIRO. And we're focused here on Eastern Australia, and the purpose of this program is to really strengthen the science that underpins decision making for coal and coal seam gas development in Eastern Australia, which has been a very topical issue in the last 5 years within Australia. The aim here is to really evaluate the potential direct and indirect, as well as the cumulative impacts of coal and coal seam gas development on water resources and the ecosystems that depend on those water resources. And we're doing this through the analysis and modelling of the geology, the hydrogeology and the ecology across a number of these regions in Eastern Australia here. That program is ongoing, and many of the results of that program will be out in the next 12 months. One of the other key regional areas that we've focused overlaps with the bioregional assessments, and that's the Great Artesian Basin. We're interested in the Great Artesian Basin because it's Australia's largest groundwater resource. And in the recent time, the team here at GA has built on a lot of research that's been undertaken in this area to put together an atlas on the geology, the hydrogeology and many of the hydrogeochemical aspects of the Great Artesian Basin in a single point, so that we can start to provide a basis for supporting decision making. The new atlas has a range of new maps, including hydrostratigraphy, fault structure, groundwater pressure and flow directions, as well as detailing the extent and thickness of many aquifers and aquitards in the region. And we believe that to build on this in specific areas going forward will provide a lot of information for water decisions within the Great Artesian Basin. Now I'd like to move to one of the other main programs that GA has undertaken in recent time, and that is the Broken Hill Managed Aquifer Recharge Program. The aim of this program was to investigate water supply options within the area of the Lower Darling Basin to provide water for Broken Hill. So two aims are really to identify new groundwater reserves and aquifer storage options in this data poor area, and to then provide advice on development of this area together with the New South Wales government agencies. As a result of this program, I think this area now has one of the most rich and diverse range of data sets within Australia in order to understand groundwater systems. And there's been a number of talks here at GA before, so I won't touch on all of the details of this program. Rather, I'd really like to just highlight some of the new approaches and methodologies that have been used in this area. One of the key areas that we've improved on is around airborne electromagnetic data sets. So this is a program that was undertaken with the Regional Resources Division within GA, as well as with collaborators. And AEM is one of the key data sets that we use to map groundwater in this area. So in the past, AEM data sets were collected by aircraft doing gridded line surveys. And this is a depth slice of AEM data showing in red conductive areas and in blue non-conductive areas. And this data was collected at a line spacing of 200 metres. What we've then tried to do is actually look at the resolution of this data set if we were to only grid it at coarser levels to find out, well, what's actually the minimum requirement in order to get the information we require. So if we were only processing it at 600 metres, you actually still see a lot of detail within the area that you could map to identify conductive versus non-conductive areas. Even if you were only to collect it at 1 kilometre line spacing, you'd actually still have a very good regional perspective of the variations within the geology and the groundwater of the area. Once we step it up to 2 metres, it becomes a little more difficult. 5 and by 10 kilometres, we're probably at the extent of the usefulness. But by testing this in an area with a lot of detailed data, we can actually make estimates on what the most useful line spacing is for reconnaissance type groundwater studies. The other thing we've done here is actually stop to have a look at different ways of acquiring the data. In the past we've done line surveys, kind of gridded surveys, but now what we're actually having a look at is perhaps doing more focused AEM surveys on key areas along a system to actually provide detail that's more cost effective in the areas that we're actually interested in, which is resulting in order of magnitude reductions in the cost of acquisition. One of the other main areas where we've been able to improve the interpretation of AEM for groundwater is through the modelling or the inversion and the interpretation of AEM data sets. And this is some of the work that Ross Brodie and Niels Christensen have been doing. And what we see here is the same data, so this is now a cross-section of AEM data, the same data processed using different inversion codes. Some of the earlier inversion codes from 2009 through to the more recent ones. And the circled area really highlights the more detail we can now get through improved inversions, both in our approach to understanding how inversions work, but also through using supercomputers, which allow us to process a lot more data a lot more quickly. And what you'll be able to see now is the amount of detail we can start to see in the near surface is actually much more highly informative and allows us to provide a lot more detailed interpretation than some of the older inversion methodologies. So again, improvements in how we undertake the science in order to understand groundwater systems. As well as collecting AEM, one of the other really key data sets in understanding groundwater is actually to undertake a drilling program to actually sample both the geology and the water at point scale. So this is a chart here that shows a drill hole. So we're down stratigraphy here where we've been able to map the variations in the lithologies, the grain size percentage variation down the hole and the hydraulic induction. One of the new data sets that the team has been looking at is this data set here, NMR or nuclear magnetic resonance. And what that actually maps is the transmissivity or the rate of groundwater flow through the aquifer, which is a really important thing to understand when we want to understand how water's moving through the system. And what you'll see from this very quickly is that this data set allows us to map aquifers, aquitards, aquifers at a single drill hole very quickly and with a lot of detail. So we think that this is a really interesting new technique in order to understand the movement of groundwater through the geology. The next step for this technology is really to trial surface NMR. So what this is the same technology but actually collected from the surface. So it's almost like doing an ultrasound from the surface to get that same information about aquifer and aquitard details. The benefit, of course, of surface NMR is that you don't actually have to drill a hole in order to collect the data. So there's cost savings in the reduction of drill holes that you actually need. It's also much more easy to acquire an area where drilling a hole might be difficult because of land access. You can collect it a much more targeted way spatially rather than just relying on where the drill holes already exist. And it's non-destructive. So this is a new technique that we think could be really valuable going forward to map groundwater flow. What we've done here is just build on some of the information that both Simon and Adam have already done. We're back here at the Menindee Lakes again. Adam's already talked a little bit about the water through space, water from space observations in this area. This has been really important in order to understand groundwater surface water interaction in this area. We can also use it to understand soil moisture, and that's telling us about recharge-discharge mapping in the area. And we can also use it to map vegetation, and this figure actually shows the variation in vegetation condition through time for selected periods of time. And what this is telling us is how the vegetation is responding to changes in both river flow and groundwater dependency, changing from times of drought to times of floods. So it tells us how the vegetation is reliant on groundwater and surface water. So it's part of that understanding of the ecology in these systems. All of this information is really critical then to build on an understanding of what the groundwater potential in any one area is. So we integrate all of this data in order to develop conceptual models of where we think key aquifers might be in order to potentially develop what we call managed aquifer recharge, which is the movement of water into aquifers that we identify so that we can then extract them further down the track. So to get to this stage, it's really the integration of a huge number of data sets in order to understand the groundwater resource, its quality, its quantity, how it changes through time, and how we might be able to use it in the best possible ways. Finally, I'd just like to point out some of the work that we're actually undertaking in Northern Australia. I think there's a recognition now of the potential to use groundwater in Northern Australia, both for irrigated agricultural development as well as a water supply option for communities. And I think the opportunity is really great to work in Northern Australia because it's a very valuable contrast to the work that we've undertaken in Broken Hill. That's because the geology is very different in Northern Australia. There's a strong seasonal control on both the climate and the water cycle. There's clearly a lot more rainfall, there's a lot more evaporation, so groundwater, surface water systems will behave very differently in this climate and environment. There's also the impact of seawater intrusion, and this map on the right here shows some of the work that the team's previously done in Northern Australia. Darwin's just down in here, and these red areas show the areas that have been identified to have very high salinity levels within the groundwater due to saltwater intrusion from the coastline here. This is based on AEM data again, together with drilling data, and it shows really quite a marked contrast and a frontier between relatively fresh water and highly saline water, which is really valuable information to inform options around where might be good areas for irrigation and where are areas that we'd need to either avoid or think about other infrastructure management options in order to use the groundwater in these systems. There's also the impact of storm surge in these areas, and in some parts of Northern Australia, Paleo Valley systems are really the only groundwater option going forward. So in this area, we're continuing to work to understand both the quality and the quantity of groundwater resources and how to assess the potential risks of both salt and groundwater salinity for these range of applications. All of this information is really valuable, but one of the real challenges we have is how to interpret and communicate this information in order to provide formal advice. And the team has a very important role in doing this to both the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science and also to the Department of the Environment. We provide advice on a range of specific issues with regards to water trigger conditions associated with the EPBC Act, the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, around coal and coal seam gas mines. We also provide advice around the association of groundwater and uranium mine development, so we provide advice to our department on that, as well as some specific mine areas such as Ranger. So this is a really important part of our work around undertaking science, but then using that knowledge and data in order to provide advice to government on the use of groundwater in a number of different environments. So in summary, just to wrap up the talk, hopefully there's a few take-home messages here from our presentation today. Firstly, that water security and availability is an issue of national significance. GA plays a really important role in both information advice, informing planning and management of water resources and infrastructure, the impacts of development on water resources, and the impacts of communities on changing in water quality and quantity. But we don't do this alone. GA is all about integrating these range of new and emerging science technologies and information to understand our water resources, and it's about collaboration right across government in order to do that. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.